Hello to folks coming in. We're just going to wait a moment as people gather, and then we'll get started in just a minute. We are going to be going live on Facebook as well, so you might see a notification that we are live streaming. Okay, people coming in. Good evening, everyone. I feel like we should have waiting room or hanging out music. Okay. Well, I will start. I'll do my welcome, and we'll kind of get started while people are still filtering in. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our program this afternoon. This is a tour and a talk with Art and Remembrance and the American Visionary Art Museum about the story and artworks in the exhibit Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family. My name is Sophie Dunn. I'm the Administrative and Operations Manager for the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation. A quick reminder that throughout the program, you are welcome to send questions through the chat or through the Q&A function. There will be time for Q&A at the end. So I'm super excited for this program. I'm a really big fan of the American Visionary Art Museum. It has a really unique way, I think, of telling the stories of artists and their work that I find is very honest and very compassionate. And I was at the museum in Baltimore over the summer and saw this special exhibition that we're going to be learning about, and was really moved by Esther's work and the context in which it was presented. So the exhibit explores Esther Krinitz's artistic representations of her youth and experience during the Holocaust through 36 embroidered story cloths. And Esther began creating these artworks in 1977 when she was 50 years old. And each story cloth tells part of her life growing up as a young girl in rural Poland, and follows her through happy memories of family holidays and times before the war, and then follows her through the Nazi occupation, living in hiding, her liberation, and her arrival in the United States. So taken individually, these artworks are really snapshots from her youth and from her life, and then taken together, they're really a diary of her experience. And they are super intricate and very beautiful collage work and embroidered details. They're absolutely amazing. And the artworks originally went on display at the American Visionary Art Museum in 2001 and have since traveled to 42 museums around the world and have now returned for a 5-year exhibition in Baltimore. So they're shown with other works from the permanent collection that are also embroidered story cloth diaries. They are works that depict South African apartheid, artworks by Native American artists about colonization in the US, as well as artworks from Tutsi genocide survivors in Rwanda. So as the American Visionary Art Museum describes, the goal is to juxtapose the power of Esther's work and the story of her experience with the experience of other innocent victims of cultural genocides, both historic and current, to underscore the great danger of demonizing any human being and noting them as undesirable or other. So we are so fortunate to have with us today Bernice Steinhardt, Esther Krinitz's daughter and president of Art and Remembrance, who will be presenting about her mother's survival story and her beautiful embroidered artworks. And before we do totally get started, I have to give a huge thanks to the American Visionary Art Museum's Becca Plum, who we'll be hearing from in a little bit, and Mavette Rosas, who was really helpful in planning this, as well as Art and Remembrance's Bernice Steinhardt and Claire Tesh, and my executive director, Esther Krinitz, for making this program possible. This program is part of a month-long series called Fragments of Memory, Exploring History Through Art and Artifact. You can check out the calendar. I'll put it in the chat to register for the other 2 events later this month with our partners at the Wassmuth Center in Boise, Idaho, and the Nathan and Esther Pels Center for Holocaust Education in Milwaukee. So without further ado, that was a very long introduction. I'm going to hand it over to Bernice.
Good evening, good afternoon. I'm in a different time zone, so allow me some time to catch up here. I'm Bernice Steinhardt, one of Esther's daughters, and it is really a great honor for me to be here with you this afternoon or evening and to share with you something of my mother's art and story. I do hope that you can get to see it somehow in Baltimore at the American Visionary Art Museum. The exhibit is beautiful. I think it's the most beautiful installation of my mother's work that we've had. And it's so impressive when you can see it for yourself in person. But now I want to share with you some of the images. Some of them aren't in the, well, they're all in the show. Some of them are not in the film that I hope you got to watch earlier. If not, please do watch Through the Eye of the Needle. We'll have a link for you. It's on YouTube. So you'll hear, if you've already learned some of the story, you'll see some pictures that are not in the film or the book, which we will also refer to. So let's get started. Let me just give you a little bit of background. My mother was 12 years old in 1939 when the Second World War began. And when the Germans invaded Poland, they came straight to her village. And they occupied it for 3 years until October 1942, almost exactly 79 years ago. They ordered all the Jews of my mother's village of Nishik and the surrounding region to report to a nearby train station, to leave their homes by 10 o'clock in the morning, and otherwise they would be shot. My mother refused to go. And she took her 13-year-old, she was 15 at the time, she took her 13-year-old sister, and the 2 of them said goodbye to their family, and they never saw them again. All my life, my mother talked about her experiences, her childhood, as well as her experiences during the war. Unlike many other Holocaust survivors, I was very fortunate to benefit from my mother's need and eagerness to share her life story. But when she was about 50, she decided that she really wanted my sister and me to see what her home and her family looked like. She had never been trained as an artist. She didn't know how to draw, but she could sew anything. So she took a large piece of fabric, and actually, if you go to the first slide, this is the picture, or the second slide, I guess. The next slide, please. Well, there we go. This was the first picture that she did. She sketched in, my mother's down at the bottom, carrying water and buckets across her shoulders from the river. Her sister is waiting for her. Her parents are in front of their house, and her brother is standing there by the horse. And she was very pleased with this picture, and she gave it to me. If you go to the next slide, please, I'll just show you a detail. You can see the intricacy of her stitching. It's really quite astonishing in this picture and all the rest. And with her braids over her shoulders. Next slide, please. So she gave that picture to me, and then she made a companion piece for my sister. And this is the view from the other side of the road. And you can see here my mother and her brother are swimming in the river, and the other girls are standing along the riverbanks. Their cows are grazing, the ducks and geese are on the grass. The farmers are coming in from the fields with wagons loaded. Her house is in the back. And this was another scene of great pastoral beauty. If you would go to the next slide, please. And you can see here too how everything is filled in, unlike actually the first one, where there's some unstitched space. This one is completely filled in with crewel stitches. And her braids are bobbing on the surface of the river. It's just an incredibly beautiful rendition. And she would say, and as I said, she gave this picture to my sister, and she would say that these were happy times. Everybody was happy then. Even though they were poor, it was the Depression, they still, they had food to eat and they had joy in their life. Next picture. So my mother didn't do any of these memories. She did those first two. She was very happy with them. Then my kids were born and she turned a lot of her creative energies to making things for them. But then about 10 years later, this would be like in the late 1980s, she went back to these memory pictures. Now I'm showing them to you in chronological order. So this is also before a memory from before the war, but she didn't create them in chronological order. She created them in what I call her psychological order. She created them based on her need to tell that particular story. So you'll see as we go through the pictures that her style is quite varied because she made these pictures over a 10-year period and she learned a lot as she went along. So this picture now is her memory of Shavuos or Shavuot in 1938. And here she and her brother and sisters are walking to their grandparents' house, cutting through this field of wheat. And my mother is walking on a pair of stilts, which her brother had made for her. She would say that her brother was the toy maker and she was the toy tester. And she was so proud of the fact that she walked all the way to their grandparents' house without falling off the stilts. And I always thought that this picture, well, I love this picture. It's one of my favorites because I think it's just incredibly beautiful. The colors, it's so alive. And it has so much energy in the picture. But also, I think I love it because of the way my mother remembered herself standing up high above everyone else and leading the way. And that was her character. This picture is the only one in which my mother embroidered in the border. She used the borders and colors of the border to distinguish time periods. So these years before the war, she used colors, and the years during the war are all embroidered in black, or all bordered rather in black. But here she continued this wheat motif. And if you go to the next slide, she loved the wheat so much that she continued it into the border. But I wanted you to see up close just the intricacy of her stitching of the wheatgrass, and then these blue cornflowers scattered among the wheat, and of course her braids, which stand on the surface of the picture. So three-dimensional. The other pictures from before the war, I think there are 4 or 5, are mostly of the Jewish holidays, and because these were among her happiest memories. Next picture, please. So now this is the arrival of the war. This is September 1939. As I said, the Germans came right to her village as soon as they occupied Poland. And here a small patrol of soldiers are coming in on horseback. Her grandparents, and this is her grandparents' house, and which stood at the entrance to the village. And my mother had heard that the Germans had arrived, and she and two of her friends went to her grandparents' house to see what was happening. And as she stood there, one of the soldiers dismounted and pulled her grandfather off the steps of his house and cut off his beard as my mother watched. You know, only Jewish men wore beards. So to see a man with a beard was a sign of a Jew. So they cut off his beard, and this is the way the war began for my mother. Next slide, please. Here you can see in a bit more detail. She used metallic thread for, you can see, I'm not sure how clear it shows up in the slide, but for the soldier's knife, bayonet, I guess, and his, the bullets on his belt, those are embroidered in silver thread. Next slide, please. This is now June of 1941. The Germans occupied the village for 3 years, and during that time, conditions for the Jews became worse and worse. And by this time, no one, and this was a small farming village. People were tradesmen. My grandfather, Esther's father, was a horse trader. He used to buy and sell, travel around buying and selling horses. Her mother raised poultry, which she would sell at the market. So their livelihoods were really curtailed. And the two oldest girls, Esther, my daughter is Rachel. So, and my grandmother was Rachel. But Esther and her sister Manya went to work for Polish farmers. And here they're tending cows, and they decided it was a beautiful day in June. They decided to go to the good pasture near the Vistula River, which ran alongside their village. And as they got there, my mother could see through the trees that they were next to this slave labor camp that was called Yanishev. Before the war, it had been a prison camp where they would bring prisoners to rebuild an earthen dam that used to get flooded every spring. But the Germans turned it into a slave labor camp for young boys and Jewish men. And here my mother recalled seeing them being whipped and forced to this hard labor. And, my mother never titled her pictures. We gave them titles once we started exhibiting the work. And this one, I think we just call the Yanishev prison camp. But I call this piece Heaven and Hell, because to me, it captures perfectly the experience of war from the perspective of its victims. So here, my mother, on the one side, you see this beautiful, idyllic, and very rich scene of flowers blooming and fruit growing on the trees, and these two innocent girls, and it's a peaceful scene. And on the other side, and it's really divided in half, this picture. On the other side is the scene of terror and these innocent men and boys being terrorized, tortured, and in fact murdered. And it just is, the composition shows the stark contrast between life as it continued every day and what was happening alongside of it at the same time. While my mother stood there, she could hear shots through the trees. And if you go to the next slide, please. She saw this soldier leading a boy into the woods, the birch forest, where he was shot because he was too exhausted to work. Next picture, please. So this is now July of 1942. And one day, the Germans sent an order to my mother's family that her brother, Reuven, he was her older brother, that he had to report to Yanishev, the camp we just saw. And her mother, Esther's mother, was horrified because she knew that Reuven, her brother, would never survive. He had just recovered from a bout of typhus. He was still not in full health. And as you could imagine, as she certainly imagined, he would never have survived the camp. So she, when the order came, she begged her husband to go in their son's place. But instead, Esther's father said, no, neither one of us is going to go. And he took his son, and the two of them went into the pine forest, and they were tapping sap from the trees, which they made into turpentine to sell to the farmers. And what was, apart from just the visual image of this, which I think is amazing, again, she remembers all these details of what was growing, what the world looked like, these mushrooms growing in this forest, and the pine cones. If you go to the next slide. Here, you can see she crocheted these sort of covers for the pine cones and then filled them with cotton to make them resemble actual pine cones, which I think is kind of brilliant. But here, what I took away from the story here was that at this point, her father was still resisting. He didn't follow orders. And in that way, I think he served as a role model for my mother and what she went on to do to save her own life. Next picture, please. This is now September 1942. Earlier that day, the day in which this picture takes place, earlier that day at dawn, there was a frantic knocking on the door of their house, the family's house, and there were German soldiers there who ordered them, screaming at them to get out of the house, and they lined them up on the side of the road and at gunpoint until someone went to fetch the sheriff of the village, who came and vouched for them because they were accusing them of being strangers, that they didn't live there, they didn't belong there. But the sheriff vouched for them, they had lived there all their lives. And so the soldiers let them go. But then later that day, Esther's brother came running home to say that the Germans were returning to the village. And so he and his father ran back to the river to hide in the grasses there. And Esther's mother, Rachel, took the two girls who were then at home and Esther in the fields behind the house, and they were running into the forest behind the house. But in this picture, she is telling my mother to go off by herself, to separate. And because she thought if they were caught, Esther would have a better chance to get away if she was in a different place from the girls and her mother. So this was kind of a foreshadowing of what Esther decided to do just actually a month after this incident. But again, the beauty of this picture is just astonishing, this intricate stitchery. I should tell you that just before she did this picture, she had developed carpal tunnel syndrome, and she had got a cortisone shot. And so she was feeling much better. And this time she went sort of haywire with her embroidery. And if you go to the next picture, you can see she covered it with these small stitches that that she did on top of the figures in there. So it really conveys that feeling of being immersed in the grasses. And here, if you go back, can you go back once, Sophie? So this is another case where, another picture where she is creating these sort of two separate worlds. On one side is her mother and the girls, and the other is where Esther is going. I mean, my mother remembers it as these fields of blue and yellow grasses. She didn't know the names in English, but it creates that feeling of separation, just the way that she divides the picture. So skip over the next two, or the next one. Yeah. So this is now the morning of October 15th, 1942, almost exactly 79 years ago. And this was the day the Jews were ordered to leave their homes and report to a train station in the city of Krasnik, which was relatively nearby. And the night before they had to leave, my mother said she cried and cried all night that she didn't want to go. And she begged her father to think of a friend of his, somebody that she could go to, a Polish farmer for whom she could work, because of course they had that experience of working for farmers as farmhands earlier, in the earlier years. And so her father finally came up with a name of a friend of his named Stefan, who lived in the village of Dąbrowa. And once my mother had this name, she was going. And she wanted to take Manya with her. She didn't want to go by herself, and Manya didn't want to go. She wanted to stay with the rest of the family. But their mother told her, Manya, go with Esther. And she listened. And so the two of them have their baskets packed. Everybody is wearing layers and layers of clothing. It was October, winter was coming. And so here they're saying goodbye. And if you go to the next slide, please. Everybody was crying. Everybody was crying. And my mother said about this picture, this is one of the earliest pictures. Actually, can you go back one, Sophie? This is one of the earliest pictures my mother did. And you can see her, she hasn't learned perspective yet. It's a sort of two-plane composition. But she used to say that this was the most difficult picture she did, not technically, but just emotionally, because this was the last time she saw her family. Next picture. And yet, as difficult as it was to create that first picture of her leave taking, she went back to that day, that experience 10 years later, after she had done almost all the rest of her pictures. She went back to the leave taking. Only this time you can see how much she had learned over that 10-year period. And this is a much more sophisticated, more complex. I mean, it's not an extremely sophisticated, it still has that kind of folk quality about it. But she really learned a lot here. And of course, it's just another beautiful picture. But interestingly, in this picture, she's imagining, she and Manya, you can see them receding into the background. Their mother had paid a neighbor to take them to Stefan's house in Dąbrowa. So they're receding into the background. In the foreground are her parents. walking to the road. Her brother is standing by the wagon. The two little girls are already in the wagon. So she's imagining here what it was like for her parents to be leaving home and to have said goodbye to their two oldest girls. And I think she, at this point, she was just experiencing these memories from a perspective that was not her own. It was an empathic kind of memory. Next slide, please. And here you can see just the detail of the people in the wagon. These are not just sort of blank faces or everyone with the same face. She remembered every single person. Next slide. Well, it turned out that the neighbor who was going to take them to Stefan's house, she took them to her brother's house and she left them there, told them to wait. And they were waiting and waiting. And then my mother got worried that she might have gone to get the Germans because there was a bounty on Jews then. So if you turned in a Jew, you could get sugar or kerosene or something of value. So my mother took Manya, the two of them left the neighbor's house, and they joined the rest of the villagers and townspeople on the road. They met up with their cousin Dina, who is walking on the road with her baby. And Manya especially, she just wanted to be reunited with her family. So she was thrilled and latched on to Dina. And then they reached a point in the road where Esther realized they were going to be in Krasnik soon. And she started pulling Manya off the road. She just wanted to go to Dombrova. And Manya didn't want to go. She wanted to stay with Dina. And it wasn't until Dina told her, Manya, you go with Esther, that Dina listened, and the two of them left and the road and went to Dombrova. But I always would say that my aunt, Manya, survived because she listened, first to her mother and then to Dina. And my mother survived because she didn't. Next slide, please. So this is their arrival at Stefan's house. And when they get there, they throw themselves into his arms and they say, we're Hersch's daughters, please help us. And he calms them down and tells them he'll look after them, and he puts them up into his attic where they're stringing tobacco leaves. And on the third day, they come downstairs and they can see that their baskets are packed. And he tells them, I can't keep you any longer. Everybody in Nishik knows that you're here with me. And if the Germans find out, if they come, they'll kill you, they'll kill me, they'll kill my family. You have to leave. So the two girls go out. It was pouring rain. The two girls are walking out on the muddy road until they come to the forest and the sun comes out and they take off their boots to dry them. And this is where my mother realizes that they cannot survive as Hersch's daughters anymore. And so she makes up these new identities for them as these two Polish Catholic farm girls from a town on the other side of the river. And their family was displaced from their farm, so they were separated from their family, so they're looking for work. That was their story. And after they left Stefan's, they went from one village to another, but they couldn't stay there long because people wanted to see papers. And of course, they didn't have them. But here, I just want to dwell on this picture for a moment. This is a very large piece. Somebody I know asked earlier how large these pieces were. The two earliest pieces are like, the first one is like 4 feet by 4 feet. And the second one was maybe a little narrower, but also very large. And many of the pieces are large. Some of them are 2 feet by 3 feet, but still you get the sense of mass here. This picture is one of the larger pictures also, because she's telling this story that takes place over several days in this one frame. So we see they arrive at Stefan's house, the attic, the muddy road that they travel on after he tells them they have to leave, and then of course the forest where they're hiding and figuring out what they're going to do next. It's really a remarkable composition, and this, if none of the others would convince you of her artistry, this one certainly convinced me of it, because of the way that she could tell this story in such an original and artistic way. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So I mentioned they went from one village and then another village. People wanted to see papers. They wound up hiding in a forest at near one of the other villages, and it started to grow dark, and my mother realized that they couldn't stay in the forest, because if they were discovered, it would be assumed that they were Jewish. So she said, we have to go to the next village, which was a place called Grabówka, and we have to go right to the sheriff's house and tell them who we are, Maria and Josefina Grochowiecka, and what our story is, and that he has to help us. And Manya was terrified at the prospect of going to an authority, but my mother said, if we are to be believed as the people, as these two girls, then we have to act like Maria and Josefina would act. So they went to Grabówka, they told them, they found the sheriff, they told him their story, and they wound up, Manya went to work for the sheriff's mother as a housekeeper, and Esther went to work for this elderly farmer whose wife was infirm, and he needed help around his house and farm. My mother cooked for him, and she did everything that he needed help with. And here she had actually planted a garden behind his house. He gave her kind of free license to do what she wanted. She loved him. She called him dziadek, which is the Polish word for grandfather, and he really took care of her. This one day, a beautiful day in June, she was tending the strawberries in her garden when these two German soldiers just trampled into the garden, and trying to talk to my mother, she just kept her head down and pretended she couldn't understand their German. And suddenly these bees, which her farmer dziadek kept in these hives in the back of the picture, they started swarming around the soldiers. But my mother didn't know exactly why, but she knew that bees didn't like strangers. And so the bees started swarming around the soldiers. Next slide. And they drove them off. And the soldiers ran out and said, why aren't they stinging you? And because they were strangers. And my mother would tell the story with a laugh, because she was so amused that these little creatures could do what no one else could do, which was to drive off these German soldiers. But I wanted you to see these exquisite bees. I fell in love with these bees. Every single one of them is perfect. Their wings, their striped bodies, the little legs, just amazing. I think a big part of her artistry was her attention to these fine details, which I think was also part of the key to her survival. Her visual memory and attention to what was going on in her environment, I think really helped her be alert to dangers and to find her way through them. Next slide, please. Well, in 1944, the Russians came through, were marching westward, and they came through the village of Grabovka, the whole area, and pushing the Germans back towards Germany, and eventually defeated them. And here, this is about 2 months after the liberation of the village. My mother went back to Nishik to see if anyone had survived. And no one had of her family, and no one knew what happened to the Jews. But one of her neighbors thought that perhaps the Jews had been taken to this camp in Lublin, a concentration camp called Majdanek. And so my mother went there on her own. You see her, the bottom of the picture, in her yellow dress, her long braids, looking still like this innocent girl, and the only spot of color really in the picture. And she is walking through the gates, and as she went through the camp, the Russian soldiers who were stationed there, who had liberated the camp, gave her a tour. And this was the first time that she saw with her own eyes what had happened. She saw the crematorium in the back of the picture on the left, and the gas chambers, and at the top of the picture, this field of giant cabbages growing on a bed of human ashes. And after she got this tour, my mother, who was 17 years old then, joined the Polish army, which was under Red Army command. And she went with the army to Germany. Next picture, please. Oh yes, in the foreground here, you see this pile of shoes. The Germans, well, first, this was, my mother went through these shoes to see if she could find any signs of her mother's shoes, which to me was heartbreaking. We were in Majdanek in 1999. We went on this trip back to Poland with my mother. And the shoes are, so the shoes are still in the camp in a big barracks building. There are tens of thousands of pairs of shoes. I mean, so many shoes that fill this building. And the image of my mother going through them just was heartbreaking. But also the idea that the Germans threw away the people, but they kept their shoes. Next picture, please. So when the war ended in 1945, my mother went back to Poland to get Manya, and the two of them made their way to a DP camp, a displaced persons camp in the American zone in Germany. And that's where my mother met and married my father, Max Krinitz, and where my aunt met her husband and married in camp. There were many, many weddings in this camp. And my father had relatives in New York, and so he applied to emigrate. And here we are, our arrival in New York. My father's cousin, Clara, who actually helped us sponsor us, came to meet us, and I'm that little spot of pink there on my father's shoulder, standing before the Statue of Liberty. This was our arrival in the United States, and my mother's memory of it was that it was an image, and that's why the Statue of Liberty looms so large, an image of freedom, welcoming and freedom to be in the United States. And in the caption, my mother recalls that Clara looked over to me when I was sleeping, and she said, "My dear child, this will be your America." Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is kind of the tail end of the story, you might say. When we got here, we were living in a house that had this, in Brooklyn, that had this old overgrown sour cherry tree in the backyard. And my mother, who thought of herself as something of a tomboy, but she was also a fantastic cook. So she saw these sour cherries and she dreamed of pies and blintzes and compotes. And so she would climb this tree in the summer and she would pass down these buckets of cherries to me and my sister at the foot of the tree. And she included in the back of the picture this neighbor boy. Helene, my sister Helene, and I were the envy of all the kids in the neighborhood because our mother could climb trees. Nobody else's could. And in the caption to the picture, my mother recalls that when she was a little girl, she would sit with her grandmother and her grandmother would say, Esther, when you grow up, you're going to go to America because in America, money grows on trees. That's, the common belief and, or metaphor anyway. And my mother would say, but Grandma, I'm really good at climbing trees. So every time she climbed this tree, she would remember this conversation with her grandmother. Next slide, please. Yeah, here you can see her hidden among the branches. Next slide, please. So that was kind of the final piece of her story, the final piece that she got to create. But in 1998, my father died, and he just had the anniversary of his death yesterday, October 6th, his yahrzeit. And after he died, my mother took all his old ties and she cut them up and created this patchwork background. She did 3 of these pictures, one for me, one for my sister, and one for my father's sister, who is still living at that time in Israel. And on it, she appliqued this portrait of my father as he looked when we arrived in the United States. I had no idea she was working on this. And so I didn't see it until she was finished, because normally I would see, we would have dinner with my parents every Sunday. So I would see her work in progress, but this was finished when I got to see it. It was astonishing to me, but it inspired her. It gave her the idea of creating these other family portraits. And in particular, she wanted to do portraits of her grandchildren. Of course, in many ways, the whole series that she did were portraits of her family. This was kind of extension of the family that she lost into the family that she created. So the next picture, please. The only one of the pictures that she got to complete before she got too sick and ultimately died was a picture of her first grandchild, my daughter Rachel. And in this picture, she's recalling this time she came to visit, and my daughter was standing at the foot of this big oak tree and looking up with this expression that my mother never forgot, looking up into these tall branches of the tree. And she narrates this in the caption. But in this caption, unlike all the others, she is speaking directly to my daughter. And at the end, she says, well, she refers to her as my dear mommy Shana. That was her term of endearment for her. And then at the very end, she says, Grandma loves you so much. It's the picture that chokes me up because it's her voice. So next picture, please. Yes, I wanted you to see what this exhibit looks like in Baltimore at the Visionary Art Museum. And here is the center. So you can see, looking around on the walls, get an impression of the scale of the pictures. But in the center of the gallery, Rebecca Hoffberger, the brilliant director of the museum, created this sort of reproduction of Esther's house with a thatched roof and a cow and the dog that Esther had, and there are some chickens back there. it just took my breath away when Rebecca just described to me this idea she had. It is really a beautiful, beautiful composition. This is, you can see here, this is the portion that has Esther's work, but in the surrounding walls or continuing walls are pictures that were done by the other artists that Sophie talked about, from Rwanda, from South Africa, from the American Southwest, Native American. There's one also that was created by a woman who we worked with as part of a storycloth making workshop. And she described her experience of coming to America. Anyway, it's beautiful in every way. I would really encourage you to see it. The next slide, please. I mentioned that we have a book. I just want you to see, just to be aware of it. If you go to our website, you can purchase it through, it's available on Amazon, but you can link to it through our website. But even better, you can purchase a copy at the Visionary Art Museum. Next slide, please. Just want to leave you and encourage you to go to our website. You can see, which is artandremembrance.org. You can see all 36 of the images that Esther created there. You can also link to the film Through the Eye of the Needle, a 30-minute film, if you haven't already seen it. So I would just encourage you to stay in touch. You can reach me by email, but I would certainly encourage you to go to the website and go to the museum if you can. And again, I just want to say thank you to Sophie, to Becca, to Claire, and to all of you for allowing me to share this art and story with you. It's really our honor.
Thank you so much, Bernice, for sharing your mother's story and showing us all those amazing details. I think even though I saw it in person not too long ago, seeing some of these pieces that weren't on view and being able to really zoom in so close is really very amazing and super special. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over very briefly to Becca Plum, who's going to say a couple words about the museum and about this exhibit.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sophie. Let me just make sure I'm unmuted. And thank you again, Bernice, for sharing your mother's work with us tonight. It always amazes me, and I learn and see so many new things, every time we do a program and every time I go in the gallery. I'm Becca Plum. I'm the Director of Education at the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore, where we currently have Esther's work. The exhibition is called Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family. I saw somebody posted the link into the chat. We can also post that as well. This work has been so beloved by our visitors and even the AVAM staff. And if you're not familiar with us, the AVAM, the American Visionary Art Museum, is the National Museum for Self-Taught and Intuitive Artistry. So our artists that we have on display, they don't claim to be artists, they just have stories to share and they need to express themselves, just like Esther did when she created her 36 embroidered works. Her work is so powerful and is currently displayed with the other artwork created in response to other historic genocides and tragedies. And while this work is very difficult to view and process, it's necessary to remember these events, learn from them, and hear the stories told firsthand by victims and witnesses of these events. So I just have a quote from Rebecca Hoffberger, who is our founder, director, curator. The exhibition juxtaposes what happened in Rwanda with what we did to Native Americans and the events of the Holocaust, because it is an ancient evil when someone decides that someone else's life is not worthy of existence. So Rebecca feels very strongly about all of these works together, and we really would love for you to come take a look and see the exhibition in person. The work will be on display until March 2024. So I just want to let everyone know that. And thanks again, Sophie, Bernice, and Claire.
Thank you, Becca. And now I'm going to turn it over to Claire to briefly just talk about the amazing set of resources that exists around this exhibition. So if you loved these artworks, whether you're an educator or you're just interested in learning more, there's an amazing bunch of resources. So Claire, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us. It really means a lot. Art and Remembrance is a small but mighty organization. The goal is really to get Esther's story into the community. And I'm going to share here my screen, sorry. Oop. My computer just went crazy on me. I will get that up in a second, but basically what we have are free resources and different activities that can be done in a community. And I might have to get my 13-year-old in a second. It won't expand here. I'm so sorry. This is terrible. Bernice, can you just continue on with the resources and the organization? And I'm going to get Lena in here to help me with this. And I did not pass this over.
Well, maybe we could go to, Sophie, can you share your, or I could do it, but if you have it open, our website, the Art and Remembrance website.
Yes, I can. Here we go. All right.
And if you would go to the education, well, since we're here, you can see the whole website, but this is the education page, and there's a tab for it at the top. And on the education page, you can access a set of 6 or 7 lesson plans.
I'm back if you want me to jump in. I'm so sorry.
Okay, well, I was just on the education page, so if you want to pick up here.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now.
Okay. Well, I hope we enticed you to go visit the education page on your own. There's a lot to see there.
Is it popping up again?
This is your...
All you see is, yeah, there's something definitely wrong here.
Well, let's let, Sophie has it up on her screen. And she has your presentation, right?
No, I did. So so right now the website is under construction on the education side. So if you go to any of these, there may be some links that aren't working, but that will be all resolved over the weekend.
I think most of them are working now.
Okay, perfect.
I think all the lesson plan.
Okay, so do you want to go to the Satori, to the film, or to Esther in her own words?
Let's go there.
Where is that?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Thinking, okay, so scroll up and not that far. Go one down.
Lena, I need your help, please.
Okay, there. So this is, yeah, go there. Click on the Satori. this is a good way to kind of get started if any of you are using this as for teaching purposes. This has, oh, did you start working on this one, Claire?
Oh, so my daughter just told me the reason I can't share my screen is because whoever had the screen on didn't take it off. That's why she's going to get it on.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, here we go. This one. No, it's this.
this is present day tech support.
The world of Zoom.
It's,
No, sorry, she's lost too. Here we go. I have it. No, thank you, sweetie. Here we
Yeah,
go.
you went on. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. It is modern day. So I'm just going to quickly go down to, I think you got a really good overview from Bernice, and sorry for the tech problems.
not really, not really.
So,
But the one thing that I just wanted to point out, because I didn't refer to it, but those lesson plans are on themes, for the most part, that are contemporary. And this was a very important feature of our education materials, is the linkage of Esther's story, a story of the Holocaust and the past, to what's happening in the world today. So there's a lesson plan. You let me know when you're ready.
oh,
Claire.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
Okay, go.
No, but that's great. Thank
So
you.
Claire,
It's
you'll
great.
want to reshare your screen. We were looking at a Bing search bar.
Is it not, it's not showing this?
We're not seeing your screen.
Oh, darn it. My tech support left. I'm so sorry. I don't know what she did.
It's okay. I mean, what
Well,
we
let's
can
just
also
go back
say-
to the website and talk through what's on the website.
Okay.
Well, Sophie has it open, so let's just go use Sophie's screen. Unless you can get to it quickly, Claire.
Yeah, I'm complete. I don't know what happened here. I'm so sorry. This is what happens when you share a computer with family members. Let me try one last time and then I'm gonna stop. This is
Well, I'll just say that the themes of the lesson plans have to do with children escaping war and conflict, one on human rights, which has materials that are pertinent to contemporary or post-World War II decisions that were made in the world. I just looked at these yesterday. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
They're-
Yeah,
no,
there's
okay.
also
Let me
lesson
look at it
plans
on
that
my
can
phone.
help in a community setting to bring forward like a narrative. You know, what these lesson plans do, and I really wish I could show you what I have on my screen right now, is it brings a human dimension to something that is, you know, sometimes not the easiest thing to talk about. And the reality is, because in current events, there still are atrocities, you know, modern day forced migration and modern day slavery, you know, issues that need to be talked about. What Art and Remembrance and our partners are doing is we're kind of finding that right balance between, you know, the critical analysis of what happened in history and also to try to bring empathy. And this is what's different about these story cloths, is that it's also, you know, different from the black and white photos that are often shown about the stories. This is a real person's story. This is her account. And so when you're able to see it from a victim's point of view, sometimes in a community setting, this is a great way to start a difficult conversation about, you know, modern day problems, or also to find the value in, you know, primary sources, in artifacts, in family stories. to really kind of connect the past to the present. And in a community setting, let's see if I can actually share this. Bernice, you actually have my slideshow. Do you want to? I had some examples of work that was done in the communities, stitching stories. It can be therapeutic and in ways that, communities can tell their stories or their personal stories. Also, for community leaders who work with youth, there's a lot of ways to adapt the lessons and resources into intergenerational learning, where students can work with peers, but also with elders. It's a great way to explore and engage in participatory social justice issues. So having Esther's story as a tool has so many different branches. I mean, we've also been able to talk about, nature and the symbolism. When you look at Esther's pieces, you see the darkness in the clouds, or, blackbirds versus white birds. So it's a really great way to get learners in your community, community members engaged in a participatory way, just from Esther's art and story. And I am so sorry about my tech issues. I wish I could fix that, but
that's totally fine. We so appreciate the going over and being able to see that there are so many resources. And so if you are an educator and you're on this call and you'd like to learn more, please do get in touch with Art and Remembrance to learn more about how to use these resources. And
I just want to also add one thing that I hope every participant on this call does is to share this with an educator. Share the links. I had a fancy slide that was going to bring you right there. The film is 30 minutes. It's a great way in a communal setting, or to have people watch at home. And then come together and discuss. And we have discussion guides. We have a scavenger hunt that community members can fill out while they watch the film. And then, of course, there's an interactive gallery. Both AVAM has an interactive gallery, as well as Art and Remembrance. And the Satori platform is not just a way that helps you to curate and collaborate all of the ideas, but it allows educators, whether you're talking about the Holocaust or other issues, to understand the impact of the history in our society. It's going to help understand the impact of human beings on history, through these difficult images, like heaven and hell, and the story that goes along with Esther's survival journey. We're able to teach about the Holocaust and how it has an impact on us individually and collectively. And I hope that everyone finds a way, not just within the classroom, but within your communities or virtually, grab the book and or watch the film. It's on YouTube. We have the links. But Esther's Art and Story, there's free resources, a virtual gallery, discussion guides, and so much more. And if anyone has any questions, I'm always happy to answer.
Thank you, Claire. So now we're just going to go into our Q&A. We have gotten some questions during the talk that were answered in our question and answer zone of the Zoom, but just to relay a few of them, and Bernice, if you can, you'll answer some of them with us. One of the questions that we have is, do you, Bernice, have any memories of your mom working on these? You mentioned briefly about kind of seeing them in process when you would go over for dinner. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of being aware of that process, talking to your mom while she was creating some of them?
Yes. As I mentioned, my family and I would go up to have dinner with my mother, with my parents every Sunday. And this was all during the time that she was working on these pictures. And so every Sunday I would see where she was in process. And when she started getting to the end of the pictures, when it was time to do the caption, I would help her write out the caption. And then she would tell me what she was working on or what she was thinking of working on for her next picture, because she was always working on some things. There was no, other than that 10-year lapse between the first two and the rest of the memory pictures, there was no lapse between them. And it was astonishing to see her development as an artist, to see her, to see how her memories, the whole process of remembering, how that unfolded, what she focused on first and next and so on. It was really an incredible process to witness. I would just wanted to say, people often ask me how long it took her to create one piece. And, you know, of course varied, but because she worked on them over roughly, created them over roughly a 10-year period and roughly 36 ultimately, I figured that it took her on average 3 to 4 months to create a piece. And she had a women's clothing store in Frederick that she was running at the same time. So it was really she was quite productive, incredibly productive and fast as she worked. She was highly, highly skilled.
Yeah, thank you. And then there's another question about kind of the difference between the blue pieces and the black pieces, the difference in the backgrounds. Can you talk a little bit more to the difference between them? I mean, is it just purely a color difference, or do you kind of see those as different chapters?
Oh no, they were definitely very thoughtful differences, the borders. The first pictures that she was creating were of events during the war, and she bordered all of them in black. But then when she started creating pictures of memories before the war and after the war, like coming to America, she decided to use different colors for those pictures to distinguish them from the war years. And she didn't always use blue. I think the Shavuos picture is one that's in blue. The Passover picture, there's another picture of Passover that's in a slightly different shade of blue. She did a picture of Rosh Hashanah, which she bordered in white. That's the only one she did in white because it was Rosh Hashanah, the holy day. So yeah, it was very purposeful, her use of color around the borders.
Thank you. And I think there was a question, you talked about it while you were speaking about the works, but there have been a lot of questions about the sizes of the pieces. So is there, we know that there's a range, but was there specific reasoning beyond like the one that you showed us where there were several parts of a story playing out in one? Were there other reasons that she would decide to do a smaller versus a larger?
Well, you know, that's a really good question. I think it had to do with the scale had to do with how she remembered the image and how much size it needed. You know, the first two pictures she did large because they were looming large for her then. And I think she just wanted to, she had a large piece of fabric, so she wanted to fill it up. Some of the pictures were of more modest scenes, and I think those were the smaller pictures. But as I said, I never asked her, why are you doing this one big? Why are you doing this one not so big? You know, it's the sort of thing that it's an artistic decision.
Yeah, and they're such incredible pieces. So thank you so much again for sharing the story and sharing your experience, learning about her work. Like every part of this is a really special and really incredible story. So thank you so much. I'm going to, just to be cautious of time, we're at 6:45 now, our time, Eastern. So I want to thank everyone for coming to our program tonight. A quick reminder that this program is part of a series this month called Fragments of Memory, exploring history through artifact and art, with our partners at the Nathan and Esther Pelz Holocaust Education Center and the Wassima Center for Human Rights. The next event is going to be on October 18th. It's going to be a very interesting talk with a scholar from the Holocaust Memorial Museum in BC about a collection of photographs from the Nazis. And then on October 27th, there's going to be an author talk hosted by the Wassima Center with author Glenn Kurz about his grandfather's 3-minute video recording that was taken in 1938 of Jewish life in rural Poland, just a year before the Nazis and World War II completely decimated the community. So it's going to be really, really interesting. I'm going to put the link in the chat. Again, I think I put it in earlier, but it's never too many times. And I want to again thank our partners at Art and Remembrance and at the Visionary Art Museum, American Visionary Art Museum, excuse me. And please, if anyone can get to Baltimore, go to Baltimore and see this show. It's absolutely amazing. And I hope that we'll see you at our future events. So thank you all so much and have a good night.
Thank you, Sophie.
Bye, everyone.